I'm Myer Siemiatycki, and I want to begin with a few words of thanks and maybe with one regret. Thanks are firstly to DiverseCity for the tremendous leadership and advocacy and networking that they have done to advance equity and diversity in this city. This is a very special coalition, alliance in Toronto, and to all who are part of that, Toronto is in your debt. Thank you very much for that. And I'm certainly very pleased that, and consider myself very fortunate that when you had this really good idea, let's take stock. We've had 3 elections at all 3 levels of government in Ontario within 12 months. Where are we with diversity representation? That was a really inspired idea, and I consider myself very fortunate that you asked me to do this work. The regret is, I wish the results weren't so dreary. To borrow a phrase that Ratna had used to describe the weather outside. I wish I had better results, a better profile to present you with, but I think we all know that meaningful change starts with problem recognition and problem identification. And for me, it all starts with the title of this report, The Diversity Gap. There is a large, deep, not diminishing gap between who governs in the GTA and who is governed in the GTA, between our lawmakers and policymakers in elected office on the one hand, and the population base over whom they make, and for whom and on whose behalf they make decisions. So what I've been asked to do is to take about 10 minutes to summarize a piece of research that has taken me about a month to cobble together. So this is the title of the report. I have to say also, in terms of appreciations, this report so far has gotten more media attention and coverage than I think anything I've ever written in my whole academic career. Certainly, front page of the Globe and Mail is good. And so I'm very grateful to journalists in the city who care about this issue and their editors. And hopefully this is a signal that there is a receptivity out there for the conversation that we're trying to embark on and some of the changes that we are trying to make. So let me start by giving you a sense of what we set out to do in this study and in this report. The full report, of course, is available online on the DiverseCity website. I really encourage all of you to go to the website, download the report. There's much more depth and detail in that report than I can possibly try to summarize. And what I'll try to do is give you sort of the big picture of the findings and patterns that we identified. So, in terms of study scope, the question we tried to answer in this research is, are visible minorities equitably represented as candidates and as elected officials, as looked at in the latest round of elections? This involved us studying and analyzing a large number of Ontarians who contested public office, and then looking also, of course, at those who were elected. The broad scope of who we are studying and analyzing throughout this report are, we looked at 321 provincial candidates across all 107 constituencies in Ontario. We looked at the candidates who ran for all 3 major political parties and looked at their identities. Then we realized that this report would be delivered this time next year if we tried to do the same for all of the federal candidates and all of the municipal candidates. So we then streamlined to the GTA. And for the GTA, we looked at the 141 federal candidates, again for the 3 major political parties, who contested office, and then lastly, and perhaps most significantly, we looked at the 347. There are a total of 347 elected positions across the GTA, with its total of 25 municipalities, 5.5 million people. If you add up all the municipal, provincial elected positions, you come to 347. This was a very comprehensive and demanding effort that we put in. And I believe that two of the researchers who assisted me in this are in the hall, and if they are, I would ask them to stand up and be acknowledged for the tremendous work that Mary Pam Vincer and Siemiatycki did. So Hila, thank you very much. Mary Pam, thank you very much. The study could not have been done without your efforts. Why look at? Change the slide. Why does political leadership matter? Why does it matter? Who governs us? Ratna talked about a number of these dimensions. It is, of course, an indicator of our progress towards inclusion as a diverse society. And the political realm, I would argue, is not just any sphere of our life. It is the highest, most significant public shared space that we have. It reflects and is intended to articulate our interests and our desires and our vision as a community. It should be the sphere, it should be the arena in which we most see reflection of the population at large. And it is therefore, I would argue, extremely important to assess the extent to which those who hold these seats mirror and reflect the population around them. A stronger balance between who governs and who is governed would mean that we are drawing on the widest possible talent pool and experience pool in selecting people for elected office. It would go a long ways to assuring a sense of belonging among all communities and sections of society, of access to government, of access to decision-making. It would minimize the kind of community marginalization, exclusion you see in other countries. And symbolically, of course, it reflects what the face and voice is of our community. Who speaks for Toronto? Who speaks for Ontario? Who speaks for Canada? A significant way to answer that question is who makes laws on behalf of these communities and constituencies. And so I would argue that looking at the political arena is a very significant sphere to examine issues of diversity and inclusion. And ultimately, of course, I think the pattern we see in elected office is a reflection of the distribution of power, influence, and status within our society. So for all those reasons and many more that I'm sure you could add, I think this is an important question to examine. And the finding, the result, unfortunately, is that in the GTA, visible minorities are very badly underrepresented across all levels of government for all visible minority subgroups. But interestingly, and I think this is an important aspect of the report, there are variations that play out at different scales, so that, as we will see, by level of government, there are significant differences in the degree of underrepresentation, the extent of underrepresentation. Relatively speaking, the provincial government, we will see, has the largest percentage of visible minority representation. It's pathetic, it's low, it's bad, but it has the saving grace of being better than the other two. The federal level of government falls somewhere in between, and then in many ways, perhaps surprisingly and shockingly to its extent, in last place is the municipal government. So municipalities which like to present themselves and have some basis for presenting themselves at the level of government that's most grassroots, most closest to the people, most attuned to their constituent communities, they have by far the worst rate of representation of visible minorities in elected office. And if we look at now the GTA and look at the big picture, what stands out is that across the GTA, visible minorities comprise 40% of the GTA's population. If we were in a perfect world where all were represented according to their numbers, then visible minorities would hold 40% of all seats in, across all levels of government in the GTA. Instead, they hold a grand total of 38 out of 347 for 11%, which tells us that the diversity gap in the GTA exists by a multiple of 4. We would need 4 times the number of elected visible minorities at all levels of government in the GTA in order for the number of visible minorities in elected office to match their proportion in the overall population. One of the, I think, interesting things you find in this report are a number of tables and maps. I wasn't sure how well these would project in our hall on PowerPoint, so I've only included one. I really encourage you to download the document. There's an incredibly rich body of statistical data that is in this report. This, in some ways, is the sort of largest comparison piece of statistical data, where just to very quickly give you a sense of what's on this table, and then subsequent slides speak to some of the trend lines here. What we have in this table, and as a flavor of what you'll find in the report, is on the left-hand side, moving from left to right in columns, we identified visible minority subgroups. You likely know that visible minority is a contentious, controversial, difficult concept that is a unique Canadian invention. The report spends about a page talking about some of the complexities and problematic aspects of that label, visible minority. But the reality is, if we want to measure inclusion, that's the category we have to use, because that is the official category on which the Canadian government collects statistics on race in this country. It's all we have. If we want to know to what extent different racialized groups are present in various workplaces, organizations, institutions, we have to measure it according to their share of population, and it's the visible minority definition in the Canadian census that tells us population numbers and population share. So what you see in the left-hand, running down the left-hand column, are the 10 subgroups that the Canadian government and the Canadian census officially identifies as examples of visible minority communities in Canada. You see the 10 running down there. Then in the next column, we cite the percentage of GTA population that each of those subgroups comprise. I guess as a rough rule of thumb, I would draw to your attention that and I may be mathematically challenged here, that with a population of 5.5 million in the GTA, if a group has 1% of the GTA's population, it's got about 55,000 people. Every 1% represents 50. So those are the size of communities that we are looking at. Then as you go along, very quickly, what you see is the absolute numbers, so how many numbers from each of those groups were elected federally, were elected provincially, were elected municipally, what proportion of, what's the percentage of seats that subgroup holds of the total, and then if you go to the last two columns, that summarizes all of the data. And the last column is important. It is the proportionality ratio. It measures the relationship between the percentage of elected positions that a group has and its share of population. So if the ratio is less than 1, if it's 0 point something, that tells us that that group is underrepresented in elected office relative to its share of population. And look what you see running down the whole list of all of those 10 groups. They are all underrepresented. In fact, some of them are totally missing. That's to walk you through very quickly one of 10 tables that exists in this report that I really encourage you to look at. Okay, so now to try to draw some themes out here. So what the report finds is that there's a diversity gap that cuts a number of different ways. It varies according to level of government, as I've said. So across the GTA, visible minorities hold 12 of the 47 provincial seats at Queen's Park. They hold 8 of the federal seats in the same 47 constituencies. They hold 8 of 47 federally. And then and you see the percentage of overall. And then municipally, they hold 18 of 253 municipal council seats for a grand total of 7%. To then break it down further at the municipal level, 16 of 25 GTA municipalities have no visible minorities on their municipal councils. 5 of the 21 have only one visible minority member on council. And if you're wondering what the City of Toronto, for the past 20 years, it has pretty much been stuck at about 11, it dances around by like 1 or 2% election after election, but most typically the number has been 11%. And this is for a city whose slogan, of course, is diversity our strength. So we've got a bit of a problem, or a large problem, as Stephen D'Souza hinted at and referred to. There are significant differences across visible minority subgroups. So if you take the 10 subgroups and you look at, okay, so 38 visible minorities were elected across the GTA. Who are they? How do they subdivide by subgroup? There were 15 Chinese community members elected in the GTA and 15 South Asian. Interestingly, I would point out that the Chinese elected politicians are largely at the municipal level. The South Asians are largely federally and provincially, so there's an interesting even differentiation in terms of at what level. 5 are from the Black community, and that is the terminology, the subgroup terminology. They are not referred to as African Canadians in the census. They are characterized as Black, so that is the official terminology. And then there's 1 each of Japanese, Korean, and West Asian origin, which leaves 4 subgroups with no elected officials, and those 4 are Arabs, Filipinos, non-white Latin Americans, and South Asians. And some of those are really large communities. The Filipino community, for instance, is close to 200,000 in the GTA, nobody elected. Interestingly, they do really well in Winnipeg. There's a strong representation. So there's some interesting comparative things to look at here. We shouldn't rush to generalize about the political capacity, the political interest, the political mobilization of different communities. Patterns can vary. The next level of variation that interested me was spatially. There are interesting and important geographic variations. More visible minorities are elected in the 905 municipalities than in 416. And within the City of Toronto, more visible minorities are elected in the inner suburbs of Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough. The lowest visible minority representation, perhaps as one might expect, is in the sprawling, exurban outlying parts of the GTA that are largely rural. But they're not a lot worse than what you see in the City of Toronto, given how bad its record of representation. So, how do we explain all this? I'm going to fall on the crutch of more research is needed. These are complicated patterns that we're laying out here in terms of differences by level of government, differences by visible minority subgroup, differences by geography. What they have in common is there's underrepresentation at all of those levels, whichever one you look at, but then when you peel and dig deeper into each of those the varieties and complexities inside each of those categories. You look at different levels of government, you look at different subgroups, you look at different geographies of the GTA, you see again differentiations within them. So I think we're looking at a complicated system, a situation that I would say I certainly feel the need to do and desire to do more research. But this is not new. I don't need to remind this audience that for a very long time, the election outcomes in Canada and in Ontario and in the GTA have reflected significant imbalances of representation for a number of groups that include women, that include visible minorities, that include youth. And there are a whole variety of different areas that need more study and examination. What role are political parties playing here? We used to think of political parties as exclusively, in the literature, negative gatekeepers, exclusionary, favoring very restricted, dominant culture, male elected candidates. There is some change going on in that, but is there enough change, and where is the change happening, in what constituencies? These are important questions. And if I'm right, there is a map here that shows us for all, well, it shows us for part of all of Ontario. And there's a longer discussion of this in the paper. What this shows us is something that I refer to maybe provocatively as the color coding of constituencies in the last provincial election. 3/4 of all 70 of the 107 seats in the last provincial election had all three candidates who were white. There wasn't a visible minority candidate to choose from. So we're looking at an election system where, before anybody's casting a ballot, visible minorities are really behind the 8 ball. They don't have nominations in a lot of constituencies. So there's going to be a limited number of seats they possibly can win. Then we have the interesting, almost converse scenario playing out, where there were 7 constituencies where all 3 candidates were visible minorities. It won't surprise you that those were in constituencies with exceptionally high visible minority concentrations, and where one gets the impression that the political parties felt that in order to have credibility among voters in that constituency, they needed a visible minority candidate. It is right and appropriate for areas with large visible minority communities to have visible minority candidates. But it's also right that visible minorities should be able to run and get elected anywhere in this province. And we're not seeing that play out. So the political parties, which in a way are reaching out and selecting candidates, especially in some constituencies, probably are not doing as much as they need to in terms of leveling the field and giving visible minorities access to a wide range of winnable constituencies. And there's some data on that in the more fully in the paper. And there's a fuller discussion of this, the implications of this map. I imagine that there will be, I don't want to take up too much more time, the terrible record at the municipal level has a number of explanations that I imagine we will get into. I think the short answer is it is a lot more daunting and difficult to get yourself elected municipally than it is federally and provincially, especially to defeat an incumbent for all kinds of reasons that we can talk about. In terms of looking at visible minority subgroups and the relative differences that play out among them, obviously factors of the size of the community, the location, its degree of residential concentration within constituencies, the kind of social capital it can draw on, the political traditions from homeland and from Canada that they can build on and capitalize on. And then spatially, why is it that suburbs are politically more inclusive than the central city? Isn't that surprising? We typically were, what we were told in the past was cities are places of diversity and great flowerings of identities, of differences, and the suburbs are conformist and one-dimensional. We're getting a different picture electorally in terms of who's getting sent to elected office, I think, from the suburbs. So I think there is some interesting work to be done in that regard. The paper closes with a very brief identification of, so what's the fix? And it points to a variety of different areas. This, I'm sure, will come up in the conversation. There are issues of electoral reform, proportional representation, better equalization and distribution of seats to reflect population, institutional commitments by government, by major institutions, the role and commitment of political parties, and of course, community ownership and voice in all of this. And I take the presence of all of you here to reflect that there is across Toronto a desire to change the picture, that there's a recognition that the status quo really isn't good enough for a community that fancies itself the world in the city. So those are my probably, I'm afraid to look at the watch, those are probably my longer than expected comments, but I hope they give you a flavor of the research, and I hope they don't stop you from going onto the website to look at the full report.